Maybe you're worried about climate change. Maybe you're upset about how most livestock is raised in inhumane conditions. Or possibly you're looking to make a change to your diet to be healthier. Whatever your reasons for eating less meat, whatever anyone's reasons, it's adding up to significant growth in what is now pretty universally being called plant-based eating, an umbrella term that includes everything from veganism to vegetarianism to flexitarianism to simply trying to eat a little less meat, dairy, and eggs. I'm Jerusha Klemperer, and this is What You're Eating, a project of foodprint.org. We aim to help you understand how your food gets to your plate and see the full impact of the food system on animals, planet, and people. We uncover the problems with the industrial food system and offer examples of more sustainable practices, as well as practical advice for how you can help support a better system through the food that you buy and the system changes you push for. Global meat production is responsible for 14.5% of human-generated greenhouse gas emissions. Factory farms are home to vast animal suffering. And we now know they're a vector for current and possibly future zoonotic diseases. Meatpacking plants are the site of dangerous working conditions, including sometimes for children. There are plenty of excellent reasons to eat less meat, and there are an ever-growing number of options for alternatives. But saying no to animal products or eating a diet rich in plants, it's not a new idea.
My name is Alicia Kennedy. I am a food and culture writer based in San Juan, Puerto Rico, but I grew up on Long Island, and I have a weekly newsletter called From the Desk of Alicia Kennedy. And I just wrote a book called No Meat Required: The Cultural History and Culinary Future of Plant-Based Eating.
Well, I'm very excited to talk to you about it today. You know, the media might have us think that plant-based eating is a trend, a thing of just this moment. But obviously, vegetarianism and veganism are not new. In some cultures, they go back thousands of years. And in this country, even, they have a rich and kind of recent history that some people seem to be unaware of. But you look at that past, both recent and, more ancient, in this new book, No Meat Required. Why did you decide to write this book? And what did you hope that it can add to this current conversation about meat and meatlessness and the role that they both have to play in our diet and our culture going forward?
I think the thing that has driven me as a food writer, and did drive me as a food writer, especially for the first part of my career, was wanting to pay homage and attention to vegetarian and vegan food and cuisine, and take seriously what I felt or understood that mainstream food media wasn't taking seriously. And I wanted to approach it the way people write about any food, even trying to write the first version of the book proposal, which was a lot less focused, let's say, on climate change or philosophical reasons, but was more like, I just want to look at this cultural history and where it has these political and subcultural roots, and just really look at the food and take the food seriously. But people don't like you to just take the food seriously when the food doesn't have any meat in it. And so they want you to be expressing kind of a big ideological framework. To not eat meat in the United States is to always be inviting an argument, it seems. And so my perspective was, okay, if I need to make an argument, I'm just going to write this book from the perspective that meat eaters, omnivores, are strange. They're going to be the outsider in this perspective that I'm going to take. So I definitely wrote the book from that perspective. And I just wanted to kind of put in, I keep calling it a container, like put in a vessel, like this reality and this history, because I think that there's a real, like you said, people are calling plant-based foods a trend, or, they're only seeing the tech meat, or they're only seeing, just one facet of this style of eating. And I wanted to be like, no, here's all these people that came before. Here's a trajectory that shows in ever increasing desire to take meatless food seriously as food, as cuisine. And if you try to discount that existed, you're going to be ignoring a lot of people, a lot of work, a lot of women's work. And that's going to be an incomplete way of looking at how food has developed in the United States over the last 50 years. And so when I'm saying we need to grapple with the future, I think that it's just understanding that, we've come really far in terms of how vegetarian and vegan food taste and how they reflect a whole foods ethos, or can it reflect a whole foods ethos, and can be really fascinating in terms of, fermentation, in terms of ingredients used. There's so much diversity in terms of ingredients. Most of the ingredients you can use on the planet are vegan. And so I want people to kind of like respect the history of that and how we came to this, and that, it's never been an easy choice to make. It's always been perceived as strange, but at the same time, it provides a framework and a foundation for thinking about how do we make plant-based eating in the future more appealing, because we have to.
One of the things you touch on in the book and I want to hear about is, why does focusing only on that urgent climate change motivator, on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, why does that get us into kind of a funny place?
Because I think that when you're talking about changing people's behavior around food, I think any one focal point is going to be a big failure. I think, and we've seen, animal rights doesn't really motivate, meat processing worker conditions doesn't really motivate, climate change doesn't really motivate, because people can reason themselves out of why their personal choice has any real effect in these larger scenarios. And with climate change, especially too, I mean, it's hard to say that right now people aren't understanding the reality. Like we've just had the hottest week on record in recorded history. So we're seeing extreme weather hitting places like Vermont and Spain, in ways, in Greece, wildfires in Greece, I just read about today. There's so much going on that it's become impossible to ignore. Whereas before this, the repercussions had been felt only in the global south, which everyone has been in the global north has been able to ignore, to a large extent, and thinking that, the effects maybe will hit us 20, 30 years down the line. But now we're hitting it right now. And the conditions under which I wrote this book it felt urgent, but it didn't feel as urgent as it feels right now. And I think right now, perhaps you can be more motivating to people on that level in terms of climate change, in terms of global warming. But I also think that it does take a very kind of polyphonic approach. I don't know why that's the word coming to mind, but like an approach that has so many levels and so many facets. And for me, always at the heart of that, the thing that changes people's minds is always good food that tastes good, and that isn't trying to be anything else. You can have all these arguments and you can make it very intellectual, but at the end of the day, you have to feed people things that they like. And that's also why I really did focus on like what the food has looked like for the last 50 years in the book. Because I think obviously I'm a food writer. So yeah, to me, it makes sense. But I also think that's the argument that really works in terms of behavior change. We know what's happening. We know bad things are happening in the world, but we also feel very small in the face of them. And focusing on what collective change means and what it looks like and what that means for cultural shifts around food is what really can change people's perspectives. But at the end of the day too, the food has to be delicious. So it takes a real holistic approach, I think, to make people make changes.
Failing to address deliciousness, or failing to achieve deliciousness maybe, is tied up in some of that funny place where you end up, and is tied up in some of the kind of tech meat solutions. We've talked about it before, about how those products kind of miss the mark. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I mean, for me, they miss the mark for myriad reasons, but mostly because they kind of sidestep the problem, which is that people are very attached to meat eating, but these things they're not going to replace all the types of meat that people eat. They're not going to replace the volume of meat that people are accustomed to eating. Like, even if tech meat were very cheap, very widely available, if you could get a chicken breast at the grocery store and ground beef that were made from whatever these things are made of, you're still at the level that people are accustomed to having those things. You can't achieve that without still using too much energy, without still using too much land, or even lab meat, which was recently approved in the US. You are, in terms of energy usage, you're still using too much energy. In terms of like the tech meat alternatives, like Impossible Burger or Beyond Burger, you're still using too much land to get one thing. And so it's kind of just an adjustment to a larger problem, which is the lack of diversity in folks' diets and its complete like reliance on protein versus to the detriment of anything else. And so for me, it's just a sidestepping of the issue and kind of just mapping the same problems onto a new product. It's been good to see, I think, that people are less interested in them, but at the same time, that just means people are eating more meat again. So again, they really did nothing to change the conversation. They made money for a little while, and now it's up in the air whether they'll make money. But at the same time, we haven't done anything to address the fact that people are too reliant on meat or fake meat substitutes, and too heavily obsessed with protein and that those are those problems that, we've been talking about for literally 50 years, more than 50 years.
There are so many compelling reasons facing us to lessen our dependence on meat. But some people are struggling because it has this hold, right, on our culture. And in the book, you dig into what meat means to us, how meat and U.S. culture are just totally intertwined, and how hard it makes it for people to imagine a meatless cuisine.
Meat historically for human beings has represented celebration, luxury, affluence. Like, it means good things for human beings. And so when you try to take that away, there is, of course, a hesitance for folks because it represents something. What I'm kind of trying to say in the book, even though the book is called No Meat Required, I am trying to be open to, who I call the conscientious omnivore, and say that, meat can exist. It just has to kind of be a luxury. The problem with the way we have approached meat in the US, and it's definitely a cultural problem, is that to make everyone feel the possibility of endless affluence, we have made meat so available to the destruction of, ecology, to, animals living in terrible conditions, workers suffering, even before COVID-19, they were suffering a lot of repetitive motion injury, suffering a lot of workplace injury, like a higher rate than anyone else. And so, and also the environmental implications beyond just greenhouse gas emissions, but in terms of making the environments around meat processing plants unlivable for folks. But we keep that all kind of hidden away. We don't like to look at that because meat is something that we have grown to believe we can't live without eating daily, maybe multiple times per day. And it's because it has this it really represents like the virility and affluence of like the American soul and psyche. And it represents economic strength as well as sort of a physical strength. And these things make sense. It completely makes sense when you think historically about what this has represented for folks. What gives me hope, and has always been my argument about meat consumption, is that if we have artificially created conditions for endless and voluminous meat consumption, we can undo it. If this isn't a natural need, if our bodies don't actually need this, if we need it maybe for the purpose of, yes, celebration or something like that, that makes sense. But if it doesn't actually fulfill a necessary nutritional or dietary need on a daily basis, we can undo this attachment to it. It just takes, this kind of reframing of what a meal is.
And it's cultural work, and you get at this in the book, right? Because part of American culture is not just the attachment to meat and all of its meanings, but it's the attachment to what is your right and what is what you deserve and what cannot be taken away from you. We all know there are many things in this country right now that people are very upset that it might be taken away from them. And one of them is meat.
Is meat. Absolutely. And I mean, there are studies saying that, there are certain groups and demographics that have more of an attachment to meat because of how it represents dominant ideologies. It represents control. If you have dominion over the natural world, then you have dominion in a grander sense, one might think. Or if you constantly have available meat, that's why the Defense of Production Act, when Donald Trump invoked that in 2020 to keep the meat processing plants open, that was very telling. It was like we were at war or something, and we absolutely needed to keep meat in the supermarkets for some reason. And it's so ingrained in that kind of mentality of like, no matter what is going on, we will have our meat. And it also represents the hesitance toward cultural change as well. So it's that dominance and that desire to control the natural world. And it is also that desire to see nothing change in terms of our culture. I mean, we're seeing right now such pushback against, women's rights, gender affirming care in so many places. And these are all part of kind of a similar ideology that is afraid of any change that seemingly removes freedom, but whose freedom, etc. So yeah, it's all part of that weird that weird American need to control and to, we have to consume constantly whatever we feel like consuming. I mean, I think we can't divorce a desire to eat meat on a far too regular basis from, same day delivery from Amazon and these things where it's like there is just this constant need to have everything all the time that definitely our cultural obsession with meat speaks to.
In your book, you say that a balance must be struck when we discuss ideas of ethical consumption in an unethical global food system that interacts with other systems of oppression, from white supremacy to patriarchy to capitalism. So can you talk a little bit about how we can define ethical eating in this context?
As individuals, we can only do so much. And if we think on an individual scale, we are doomed to failure all the time. If we think about what we can collectively change, how we can work toward these cultural changes that need to be made on a collective level within community, just and thinking on that scale rather than thinking it's all on my shoulders, because of course it's not. And of course, because that perspective gives into the perspective where you start saying there's no ethical consumption under capitalism, so there's nothing I can do. And so if we think about how our choices are intersecting with the choices of our neighbors, where is our food coming from? Are the workers boycotting? I mean, who owns the land? Who is benefiting from it? Like, there are all these questions we can ask ourselves. We don't have to ask ourselves all of them all of the time, but having these things in the back of the mind will ultimately cause, I think, folks to adjust their consumption. And yeah, it's not just about that individual choice. It is about how our choices are intersecting with other choices, how they're trying to not support oppressive systems, how, you're trying to support folks who are doing things correctly. We tend to think of these things as kind of useless and bourgeois, but they do add up to something. Because I talk a lot about, shopping locally and what that means. And obviously for me here in Puerto Rico, it means something different for someone in New York City, or it means something different from someone in the middle of the country. But it isn't something that is just about, oh, it's my individual, like I feel good about it, or this food tastes fresher to me. It is those things, but it's also, I'm supporting a local economy in a place that, is suffering like a 40% poverty rate. I am supporting a local economy in a place where 85% of food in supermarkets is imported, and when we think of our regional food systems, thinking of how we are supporting just smaller food systems and not always thinking so much about, oh, how do I fit into the global food system? It's no, how do you fit into your local regional food system? And how can you make that better for folks? And what does that look like? And what can it look like? It's hard, I think, because we've thought so much about what we can do individually, that it's really hard to break out of that cycle. I also think that thinking individually is it supports the feeling ineffectual. It supports there is no ethical consumption under capitalism, so I'm not going to try. But when you start to think about what is my place in this larger system, it helps to that feeling of uselessness and that feeling of futility that can start to take over, because then you do have little changes you can make every day.
And all of those little changes mean going against the mainstream. You talk a bunch about this in the book. Why has not eating meat been associated with weirdness for so long? You end up exploring some of the counterculture roots of vegetarianism and veganism. What can you talk about some of those roots? And then also what gets lost and maybe what is gained when meatless eating goes more mainstream and it loses some of that funk, Yeah,
it's interesting because in the US, not eating meat on the whole is a counterculture choice. It is an alternative choice. There are certainly places or cultures where not eating meat is a more mainstream choice, or it is used in service of sort of, different ideologies. But in the US, especially for the last 50 years, it has been this countercultural alternative way of eating that has always been in response to big agriculture. It's always been in response to those dominance ideologies of like, I can control what you do, I can control the natural world, et cetera, et cetera. It's interesting because now that I'm talking about the book more, I think for a lot of folks, it's difficult to think of like US culture or US cuisine as something that is its own thing. But it is really interesting because I think in the context of meatless food, like there is this like very specific like US approach to it that is developed. And yes, it is about using tofu to make buffalo wings and that sort of thing. But at the same time, it's also like a very cool thing that happened. It's like the hippies who were at like the farm commune and started making tempeh, and like William Shirtliff, who was a monk and went to Japan and got really into miso and tofu and tempeh too. And then, folks like Deborah Madison, who also came from the Zen background and started cooking at Greens in San Francisco and like really changed the narrative on what vegetarian food could be. And so these folks were all coming out of this kind of rejection of the Western thought process around food, but also around spirituality and about, our role in the world. But then you also have ecofeminists, which that's kind of has a French origin, but it's also about rejecting the idea that we can dominate nature and seeing nature as a feminine energy or a feminine entity as well, and needing to work with it, and seeing that, for a lot of folks, eating meat was kind of more of a masculine ideology. And to reject meat was also about rejecting the dominant culture. It was about rejecting husbands who were very patriarchal, and opening feminist restaurants. And then you have the kind of punk anarchist vein where folks were writing zines and just, giving away photocopies of these zines. And there was no desire to copyright recipes. Not that you can copyright a recipe, but there was no desire to it was about sharing information and sharing this kind of like hospitable approach to food that would let everybody in. And even now, even as it's gone mainstream, there's still this element of the weirdness that has always glommed on to vegetarian and vegan eating historically. The vegetarians throughout history have always been weird people to the mainstream. They have always been in their own little clique or cult and doing something else. But I think right now we're at a really interesting point, an inflection point, where our need to change how we eat might start to tip the balance against the weirdness. And I think that's a good thing, but it's only a good thing if there's also this remembrance of why it was weird. And it was weird because it was a rejection of patriarchy. It was a rejection of corporate agribusiness. It was a rejection of, the idea that we have this right to use land, use animals, use workers in ways that were to their detriment and our benefit. So it has to retain that, because otherwise then it's just another bunch of big corporate agribiz with a different product. And so that weirdness, I think, is really important.
Now, what about this word? I've been skirting around this word plant-based, and you and I have talked about this on the podcast before and maybe kind of ridiculed it. So imagine my surprise when the book arrived and the subtitle had the word plant-based in it. Talk to me about this word, your relationship to it, what you think of it.
For me, plant-based was a way of saying vegetarian and vegan without saying vegetarian and vegan. Also, since we last spoke, I definitely have changed my thinking on it. So I had this very knee-jerk reaction to the phrase plant-based because I saw it as this like marketing term that was trying to get away from all of that weird baggage that the terms vegan and vegetarian have had historically. I talked to Michelle
Simon.
Yes. She really did turn me around on it and was like, people don't like vegans. And if you call something like the Vegan Food Association or something, people are going to say, go to hell, because frankly, a lot of people have had they've had maybe one bad experience with a vegan being nasty to them. And then they say to hell with the whole thing. And you know what? I respect that. So I think plant-based is a term that is useful because I used to hate it because I felt like it was rejecting the weirdness. But now I'm like, no, it's really urgent that we do get people to come around to eating less meat, and whatever phrase does it is fine with me. Like I really did change my thinking around it. And because I really do feel the urgency that people change how they eat. Like I love being a vegetarian and I love saying I'm a vegetarian. I also think it's like really like such a nerdy thing to be as a vegetarian, but like a lot of people don't want that. So if you're just like, oh, well, I eat a plant-based diet, if that makes people do it, say it more and be it more, then I'm happy with that. Yes.
I also love that you're willing to change your mind. You talk in the book also about bad experiences with bad vegetarian food. And so I want to come back to that. You also at the top of the conversation talked about how important it is to sort of address the culinary possibilities of vegan and vegetarian food. Can you talk a little bit about what damage bad vegetarian food has done to this movement?
I think there's just nothing that will push someone away from making a vegetarian or vegan choice when confronted with a menu than having had an experience of like dry seitan at one point, or just like a casserole filled with like just dairy to try and make up for a lack of meat. I do talk about bad vegetarian food, but I also think this was part of the problem of how people were cooking in the US generally. Like we can talk too about how people overuse dairy, overuse butter, until people kind of learned a less, let's say, French cuisine driven type of cooking, until people learned how to use salt in the right way. You learned how to use olive oil, learned where acid goes in a dish. And like there was a lot of cool stuff that happened in the 80s and 90s, I think, that really changed how anyone cooked, whether they were cooking meat or cooking vegetarian food. And vegetarian food definitely maybe took a bit longer for folks to come around to, because there's that terrible connotation in terms of like margarines or cottage cheese, or like, and that health food connotations as well, though now everyone on TikTok is using cottage cheese. But there were all these bad connotations around the health and the weirdness, and then those were compounded by the fact that a lot of people in the US didn't know how to cook anything that wasn't over the top. And so once we're starting to see vegetables being treated properly, and like it's not just like boiled turnips that have no seasoning and everything boiled all the time, like vegetables just boiled like and then butter, and like it's like that's it, ta-da. Like once we learned how to get away from that, like, and that was just a big cultural shift where it's like, okay, like Food Network 1993, we're gonna start to like cook differently, and like everyone learns that from Ina Garten that they can make their own salad dressing, and like things start to taste different in general, and vegetables benefited, but vegetables definitely were like a later comer, like it's still a memory for a lot of us when people started to make Brussels sprouts that tasted good. In the last 10 years, we've still seen people really adjust like how they cook broccoli, how they cook cauliflower. Like all of a sudden everything is delicious and like caramelized and like smoked and stuff like that. And like vegetables have had, and fruits too, have had this real renaissance in the last like 10 years. And I think it's just kind of followed a broader cultural trend in food, but for sure it took a lot longer for the vegetables to get treated with any respect.
And obviously for you, this is personal, having been a vegetarian since your teen years, and you talk about that in the book. You also talk about the gifts that vegetarianism has given you. Can you describe those gifts and how they might provide a template for a vegetarian life worth living, or at least vegetarian meals worth eating? You called it new ways of eating with abundance, which I loved.
Right. Well, I've stopped eating meat actually in my 20s, but I always dabbled. Being vegetarian, not eating meat, having had a vegan more than half a decade of my life, I learned about things that other people would just not have known anything about. And obviously that's what the book is. The book is like all this stuff that I got into because I was doing this, but also like every time I was learning something new about, like, I don't know, how to make a buttercream from coconut oil or something like that, like, or, why people started to use cashews to make cheese, like that sent me down a whole wormhole, where the Miyoko's cheese that I started to actually like, I was like, why cashews? And then you start to go back and you start to see evidence of the cashews emerging in the cookbooks. And it's like, oh, okay, it was coming. And then you have to go to Rejuvelac and you have to go to Anne Wigmore, which is another microhistory in the book. I love that. Like, I love, reading on Lagusta's blog, like 10 or even more years ago now, about like vegan deviled eggs, like setting almond milk with agar and using black salt and that sort of thing. And once you stop using animal products for a little while and really dig into it, like I have a completely different cooking brain from someone who has never been vegan 100%. Even now that I'm vegetarian, the thought of using, I'll see people make a cake with like 6 eggs and I'm like, that is horrifying. Like, absolutely not. I will figure out how to make the cake with no eggs. And if I can't, like, I'm maxing out at 2 eggs for a recipe, but like it forever changes your brain. And and then you see people who don't have that kind of sense, and they can really struggle with substitutions or with like adjusting recipes or that sort of thing. I think that it's so cool to have the knowledge and the pantry to navigate that no matter what. Like, I have flaxseed meal, cornstarch, arrowroot in the freezer. Like, so I know how to replace eggs. Like, if I have overripe bananas, I can replace something with those. If I have some pumpkin that I've roasted, I can use that. Like, the knowledge just like allows you this different sense of abundance, because for a lot of folks, yes, having the ability to just use 6 eggs frivolously is abundance and luxury. But for me, it's really just being able to use those eggs well and like eat them as eggs or use them where they need to be used, where there is no replacement for them. And that makes them stretch longer. And those other ingredients are like they're pantry stuff. It's not stuff or it would be something that would go to waste too, like aquafaba. That kind of different thinking, I think, is just a way to reframe what it means to have abundance and have luxury in your kitchen. It's being able to not waste things and have the know-how to use things very, very well in the places where they really, really shine. And like, for me also, just living here in Puerto Rico and getting to use breadfruit and getting to eat all this different fruit, and like it expands the horizons to see all this possibility with vegetables and with fruits. And it just changed my brain forever to have been vegan, because I can't like just do anything normally anymore.
You talked about being vegan for half a decade, but now you're a vegetarian. So why did you make that shift?
I was starting to have a existential crisis about vegan as a label, and the utility of veganism, really. Because again, like, it can go back to the cashews. It's like, why am I eating cheese made from cashews when I could eat cheese made by like people I can see or go meet, from the milk of cows or goats or whoever that I could go meet? Like, why am I getting the cashews from across the world, farmed in God knows what conditions? And so that was a crisis that was happening for me for a long time. And then I started to travel a lot more in 2017, and it just required me to be vegetarian. Being vegan was a kind of an obnoxious thing in a lot of places. It would cause me to not have a full experience. Whereas being vegetarian, I'm always saying, like, no matter where you are, someone knows a vegetarian, but wherever you are, someone does not always know a vegan or how to cook for a vegan. And so being vegetarian is something that has just allowed the world to be more accessible to me. I'm always kind of saying I do want to eat in a more conditional way. Like, I'm not going to eat meat. That's just my personal wall, but I always want to be able to and be open to eating what is appropriate to place.
One of the things you write about is sort of grappling with that decision, or taking the leap, really, to give up meat. What advice do you have for taking that leap?
Start slow. I started really dabbling like over a year before I gave up meat, and I went vegan like cold turkey. I didn't go vegetarian at all. Like, I had in my teen years, like, always been vegetarian, then stopped, then been vegetarian, then stopped. And then finally, when I was in my early mid-20s, I was like, I really don't feel good about eating this way anymore. I've always had this inclination, but I'm really hitting a wall with it. And my then partner had been traveling a lot for work. So whenever he was gone, I would make myself all vegan meals. And that was the way I kind of made the change for myself. Was I just would be like, it would be like 5 days at a time vegan. And then it wasn't so hard to go 6 days at a time, 7 days at a time, 365 days at a time. But I started to see that change in myself and feel that change in myself. And it can be a really gradual shift. Just like I'd hated the phrase plant-based. I think for a long time, I hated things like Meatless Monday and vegan before 6 or whatever. But I do think they're so useful because that's an easy challenge. I'm going to have something vegan or vegetarian for breakfast and for lunch. And then for dinner, I'll give myself the opportunity to eat meat if I want to. I think what's going to happen is a lot of people are just not going to want to. And they'll find that those small changes will add up to this realization that they don't have to eat meat all the time. And then maybe they start to be like, I'm a Thanksgiving meat person and a Christmas meat person or this holiday meat person. And you know what? If those were the only days folks ate special meat dishes, that would be huge. I think giving yourself space for a gradual shift is the most important thing to do.
For Kennedy, that culinary exploration and the pursuit of deliciousness, they're key to embracing a diet with fewer or no animal products, as well as understanding plant-based eating in the context of its past, its rejection of the mainstream, and its embrace of a way of doing things that's not just about raw efficiency. This grappling with a new approach to eating is something we are all going to have to do as we face the reality of our climate future. What You're Eating is produced by Nathan Dalton and foodprint.org, which is a project of the Grace Communications Foundation. Special thanks to Alicia Kennedy. You can also hear her on our episode called Who Profits from Fake Meat? You can find us at www.foodprint.org, where we have this podcast as well as articles, reports, a food label guide, and more.
Feeding children is one of the most basic human responsibilities. So why do we so often feel like we're failing at it?
I'm Jane Black.
And I'm Liz Dunn.
We're moms, and we're food journalists. And in Pressure Cooker, we tackle some of the thorniest issues around how we feed our kids. How important is family dinner? And why do kids refuse to eat their vegetables?
To find out, we're talking to experts and hearing from parents locked in the daily struggle to feed little people with big personalities.
Listen to Pressure Cooker wherever you get your podcasts.